Alright, welcome back to another Premiere Pro video. This time I'm interested in seeing what happens if we do a transition from 1920 1080 into basically the mobile format, right? And the resolution on mobile, the ratio is always 9:16, but so what I could do actually, now I think about it, so I could actually show, if we double click here, you see it loads it into the source. So what I'll do then is show some extra things, right? I don't actually normally do this bit because honestly I don't really find it very interesting. But if we click this button, we can do mark in, and then I'll do it. Really, this is more about the transition itself. Mark out, and then we can insert there, right? All right. So once we insert, I tend not to use the source, but it is kind of useful in certain aspects. So what's the first problem? The first problem is this is not in the right resolution. So what we need to do is we need to match it. So if we go through the options, we can see we've got this scale to frame size. Take a look at that. Now, there may be a difference between scale and set to frame size. They seem to do kind of the same thing. All right, so if we look at what we've got then, we've got this clip and then that. So we've got enough room to work with, right? With like a 2-second transition, but obviously they're very, very different clips. So there's obviously a bunch of different ways that we could transition these into each other. I think probably the way that I'm going to try to do it though is to try to do something on each end, right? Interesting that you could just do a rotation here, right? So should we try rotation? I was thinking of doing like hold keyframes. One of the things that we're going to need to have, right, before we look at anything, is we're going to need to have a background color here, because we don't want it just to be completely this, right? So what you could do, this is actually something you could, interesting thing you could do. You can see that we've got like blues in each shot that are kind of similar. What I'm going to do is just take this thing. I think a darker one, maybe one I can actually remember the numbers. 364359, right? All right, so we'll do a new just do 364359. Well, that's what we're going with anyway. Okay. And we don't need any point before here, right? So this basically, so what is the blending mode on this going to be? All right. Overlay is normally the one, like, overlay is not that great, right? So we can see it's quite dark there. We have it there, it's like that. So it looks more like vibrant there. So we can see that the lighter color is actually the one we want, not overlay. Because as we do the, so yeah, basically it makes no difference to the actual clip, right? When we do it that way. So that all looks good, right? This actually needs to go to the end as well. So how are we going to work on the transition? Well, one thing we could try and do is say we start this transition at this point here. We can see what happens if we do a rotation at this point here, right? We could try a rotation here and see what happens. So we'll just do a simple rotation. Go to the end. Remember to press end. And what should we do for 360? Um, let's try maybe an odd. Let's try 540. You know what I'm going to do? I just want to make this a little bit bigger as well. So I'd like to show things. I may be able to get away with half as well. It's probably too much, right? What we could do, instead of going maybe that far in the rotation wise, because the thing is, when it gets to this point, well, I can't get it now. But the point is when it gets to 90, it's done, right? Let's try and change it to 90 instead. Instead of all that, we'll just do 1/4 rotation, right? See, that already looks better, right? But it's too big. So we actually need to scale it down as well. Okay. So if you want to get to the beginning, the best way to get to the beginning is actually to use this timeline here, and that way actually at the beginning, or you can shift. All right, so here we're going to want a scale as well. So what I'm going to do actually is do a scale. Technically, you have to eyeball it, I guess, because it's not actually going to be appearing there, is it? And then at the end, we're going to scale it down to 57. So look at that. When I actually look at the... It's not bad, right? The other thing, what else do we notice that's going on here? At this point, we sort of see that there's a clash between the sharp edges of the edge of the frame. So maybe like a blurriness effect to give us a little bit more interest, right? A blurriness, because yeah, basically, if you look at something and you say, "Oh, there's a sharpness to that," or "There's a blurriness to that," often the answer is going to be somewhere in there. Let's try maybe a Gaussian blur here, and let's look at what we've got on the stats for this. Right. Is the Gaussian the one I want there? I often go for Gaussian just because it sounds the coolest, but I actually don't think that is the one I want. Camera blur? Nope, I want that. I really want one that can do the has something with like an edges direction. Yeah, this is what you want, the directional blur, right? Because it's actually gonna. Let's do blur length. You see, that does an interesting effect on it, right? It creates at least something a bit more interesting about that. All right, so let's just create a. So this is going to create a blur around the outside, right? I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I could potentially want. Let's try something crazy with it. Blur length. I'm going to increase that. Can we go negative on that? No. If you go negative, it would be interesting because then we could actually go. Let's just try something like this. You can see what I'm going for, right? To try and make it look like a mobile phone. So you know what I could do? if we create the same thing here, right, that would actually automatically create the transition potentially, right? So let's try that. So what I'll do is I'll just choose a small section here. Well, I don't even need to. You could separate it all. But for what no, you know what? I will just separate it all out because if I do the blur, right. So we'll just do a small section here. And on this section, we want it to basically blur with the same blur, the directional blur. We want it to blur from blurry to unblurry. All right. So that was I think it was like 177 on this, was it? All right, so make sure we're at the right spot. There. And then at the end, the blur is 0. Let's see how that transition now looks. Yeah, one of the things I guess that is kind of interesting, I kind of like it. It's quite unusual what I've done here. Obviously, you can see the transition, but you could easily just put a sound effect in there. But that certainly makes like a more interesting transition than you might have otherwise got, right? One of the advantages of doing it this way rather than, because obviously you may think like, oh, you should really do it with this menu, the video transitions menu. One of the advantages, of course, is that if I wanted to, by not actually combining them like that, I'm in the position where I could basically drag this whole section. I could basically drag this whole section to the right, put something in the middle, right? Yeah, because if this was blurrier, here's the interesting thing, right? If this was blurrier at this point, you could actually get it to meld, right? If this was blurry at this point, basically, if this was blurrier, it would be more one color, right? So you could synergize it with a background. And then when it comes in again, it could basically, it's almost like this would float into a background and then this would float out the background. So thanks for watching.